On a Tuesday morning in March of 2003, Dale Whitmore stood in the gravel lot outside his machine shop in Harlan County, Kentucky, and watched a flatbed truck pull away with the last engine he would ever order from Consolidated Industrial Supply. He didn't know that yet. He was holding a clipboard with a purchase order on it, and he was thinking about the stack of blown motors sitting inside his bay doors, and he was thinking that he had maybe 3 weeks of parts inventory to get through the worst of them. He was not thinking about what would happen when those parts ran out. That came later. Let me tell you about Dale Whitmore, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Dale was 58 years old in 2003, and he had been rebuilding engines in Harlan County for 31 years, not restoring them, not tinkering with them on weekends, rebuilding them professionally, commercially, as the sole operator of Whitmore Engine and Machine, a 4,400 square foot shop on Route 119 that he had built with his own hands on a half-acre lot his father had left him. The building had a steel roof and a concrete floor and a Blanchard grinder that Dale had bought used from a closing shop in Knoxville in 1987, and had kept running through sheer stubbornness and an encyclopedic knowledge of its internal geometry. The sign above the bay doors was hand-painted. The phone on the wall was a rotary until 1994. Dale did not believe in spending money on things that already worked. He had started the shop in 1972 with a single engine stand, a set of used micrometers, and a reputation for honesty that his father had spent 40 years building as a mechanic at the county road department. Dale's father, Everett Whitmore, had taught him that an engine is a system of tolerances, and that a man who understands tolerances can fix anything that breathes and burns. Everett had also taught him that the parts are never the problem. The problem is always the man who didn't understand the parts well enough to keep them from failing in the first place. Dale had carried that lesson for 31 years, and it showed in his work. His engines didn't come back. In 3 decades of operation, Dale Whitmore had a warranty return rate that the dealers in Lexington would not have believed if someone had shown them the books. The people who brought him their motors were coal operators, logging contractors, county road crews, independent truckers, and farmers from 4 counties who had learned through word of mouth that Dale Whitmore could fix what the dealers said couldn't be fixed. They dropped blown motors at his gate the way people leave packages on a porch, with confidence that someone competent was on the other side. 15 years of that. 15 years of flatbeds backing up to his bay doors with cracked blocks, spun bearings, grenaded pistons, and warped heads that the factory dealers had already quoted as unrepairable. Dale repaired them. He always had the parts. Consolidated Industrial Supply was the reason he always had the parts. They were a regional distributor out of Charleston, West Virginia, that carried engine components for industrial and agricultural equipment going back to the 1950s. Bearings, rings, gaskets, oversized pistons, cam followers, valve guides, the kind of parts that the national chains had stopped stocking because the equipment was too old and the market was too small. Consolidated had stocked them because their founder, a man named Harold Prater, had believed that someone needed to. Harold had built his business on the conviction that a machine that could be fixed should be fixed, and that the parts to fix it should exist somewhere in the supply chain. Harold Prater died in 1998. His son sold the business to a regional consolidator in 2001. The consolidator spent 18 months reviewing the inventory against a profitability matrix, and then began discontinuing product lines that didn't meet their margin thresholds. In March of 2003, They sent letters to their account holders informing them that 340 part numbers were being permanently discontinued, effective 90 days from the date of the letter. Dale received his letter on a Wednesday. He read it standing at his workbench. He read it twice. Then he set it down next to a Cummins NH series block he was boring out for a logging contractor in Letcher County, and he stood there for a long time without moving. Of the 340 discontinued part numbers, 94 of them were components he used regularly. Regularly meaning monthly, meaning that without them, there were entire categories of engines he would no longer be able to rebuild. Older Caterpillar diesels, older Detroit two-strokes, a whole generation of Continental flatheads that the county road department still ran in their motor graders. The equipment wasn't going anywhere. The people who owned it couldn't afford to replace it. They needed someone who could fix it, and the parts to fix it were about to disappear. Let me tell you about what Dale did in the 90 days after that letter, because most men would have started making phone calls to their customers explaining the situation. Dale did not do that. Dale drove to Charleston. He drove to Charleston in his 1991 Ford F250 with a legal pad on the passenger seat and a list of every part number he needed. He went to Consolidated's warehouse on a Tuesday morning and asked to speak with the inventory manager. The inventory manager was a 34-year-old man named Kevin Stahl, who wore a polo shirt with the new parent company's logo on it, and who had a degree in supply chain management from West Virginia University. Kevin Stahl explained to Dale, politely but with the practiced efficiency of someone who had delivered this news many times in the past several weeks, that the discontinued lines were being liquidated and that Dale was welcome to purchase remaining stock at a 40% discount before the liquidation deadline. Dale asked how much remaining stock there was. Kevin Stahl pulled up a spreadsheet. There was, across all 94 part numbers Dale needed, somewhere between 18 months and 4 years of inventory depending on his usage rates. Dale bought all of it. He did not have the money to buy all of it. He had $47,000 in his operating account and a $30,000 line of credit at Harlan National Bank that he had never drawn on. The total invoice for the liquidated inventory came to $112,000 after the discount. Dale went back to his truck, sat in the parking lot of Consolidated Industrial Supply's Charleston warehouse for 22 minutes, and then went back inside and told Kevin Stahl he would take it. He called Harlan National Bank from the warehouse parking lot, spoke to a loan officer named Patricia Graves who had known his father, and arranged a short-term note against the shop property. He rented 2 box trucks. He drove back to Harlan County with $112,000 worth of engine parts stacked in rented trucks, and he spent the better part of a week building wooden shelving along the back wall of his shop to hold all of it. His wife, Carol, stood in the doorway of the shop on the 3rd evening of shelving construction and looked at the rows of cardboard boxes and steel bins and said, very quietly, that she hoped he knew what he was doing. Dale said he did. He wasn't entirely certain, but he said it with enough conviction that Carol went back inside, and he kept building shelves. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone make a decision that looked like panic from the outside, but was actually the clearest thinking they had ever done? That's what Dale Whitmore did in that parking lot in Charleston. He wasn't panicking. He was calculating. He had 31 years of records in a filing cabinet in his shop, every engine he had ever rebuilt, every part number he had ever ordered, every customer he had ever served. He knew his usage rates the way a farmer knows his soil. He knew exactly which parts he needed, exactly how many he used per year, and exactly how long that inventory would last him. He bought time. Specifically, he bought somewhere between 4 and 7 years of time, depending on how the work came in. And he had a plan for what to do with that time. Let me tell you about the plan, because this is where Dale Whitmore stopped being a man with a parts problem and started being something else entirely. The parts he had bought from Consolidated were finished goods, manufactured components ready to install. But Dale knew, because he had been working with these parts for 31 years, exactly what they were made of, exactly what tolerances they were machined to, and exactly what equipment you would need to make them yourself. He had a Blanchard grinder. He had a lathe. He had a boring mill. He had a surface grinder and a honing machine and a valve seat grinder that he had rebuilt from a parts machine in 1989. He had, in short, most of the equipment you would need to manufacture engine components from raw stock if you understood the metallurgy and the geometry well enough to do it correctly. Dale understood both. What he did not have was a source for raw stock. The bar stock, the cast iron blanks, the bronze bushings in rough form that he could machine into finished parts. He spent the first 6 months after the Charleston trip locating those sources. He drove to machine shops in Pikeville and Hazard and Corbin. He called suppliers in Cincinnati and Louisville. He found a foundry in Barberville that could pour cast iron to his specifications if he brought them a pattern. He found a steel service center in Knoxville that could cut bar stock to length and ship it on a 2-week lead time. He built, piece by piece, a supply chain that did not depend on any single distributor, that reached back to raw materials, and that he could operate from his shop in Harlan County with his own equipment and his own hands. It took him 3 years to build it completely. During those 3 years, he was also running the shop, rebuilding engines, keeping his customers' equipment running. He worked 6 days a week, and most Saturdays he worked until dark. Carol brought dinner to the shop on those evenings, and they ate together at his workbench with engine blocks on both sides of them, and Dale explained what he was working on, and Carol listened, and that was their life, and they were not unhappy with it. By 2006, Dale Whitmore could manufacture, from raw stock, 61 of the 94 part numbers he had originally purchased from Consolidated. Not approximate versions of them, exact replicas, machined to the same tolerances as the original components, made from equivalent or superior materials. The remaining 33 part numbers were components he couldn't practically manufacture in-house. Multi-element gasket sets, precision ground crankshafts, cast components that required tooling beyond his shop's capacity. For those, he had located alternative suppliers, smaller specialty houses that still served the vintage industrial market, or he had found ways to modify available components to fit. He kept the consolidated inventory as a buffer and drew it down slowly, using his manufactured parts wherever he could and the purchased parts where he had to. Let me tell you about what happened in 2007, because that's when the other shops started calling. There were, in eastern Kentucky and southwestern Virginia, perhaps a dozen independent engine rebuilders who had been in the same position as Dale in 2003. They had received the same letter from Consolidated. Most of them had not driven to Charleston. Most of them had bought what they could afford, which wasn't much, and had spent the intervening years watching their ability to service older equipment slowly contract as their parts inventory ran out. By 2007, several of them had stopped taking certain engine families entirely. They were turning away work. Customers who had relied on them for 20 years were being told that the parts didn't exist anymore. Word travels in a small industry. It travels at the feed store and at the county road department garage and at the table in the back of the diner where the equipment dealers eat lunch on Fridays. The word that traveled about Dale Whitmore was specific. He could still fix the old stuff. He had parts. Nobody knew exactly how, but he had them. The first call came from a shop in Pineville. A man named Gerald Combs who had been rebuilding engines for 22 years and who needed a set of oversized pistons for a Continental F244 that he had promised to a county road department by the end of the month. Gerald had called every distributor he knew. Nobody had them. He called Dale as a last resort, half expecting to be told the same thing. Dale told him to come by on Thursday. Gerald drove to Harlan on Thursday morning, and Dale handed him a set of pistons machined to point 030 over from a bar of 4032 aluminum alloy that he had turned on his lathe and finished ground on the Blanchard. Gerald held one of them up to the light and turned it slowly and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "How much?" Dale told him. Gerald said that was less than he had paid Consolidated. Dale said he knew. After Gerald Combs, there were others. Not many at first, 3 or 4 shops in the first year, calling about specific parts for specific jobs. But the calls kept coming, and Dale kept answering them, and by 2009 he had a secondary business running alongside the engine rebuilding, manufacturing and supplying obsolete engine components to independent shops across a 4-state region. He had not advertised. He had not built a website. He had a handwritten ledger with the names of shops and the parts they had ordered, and he restocked the raw material when it ran low, and he machined parts to order when someone needed something he didn't have on the shelf. The irony, which Dale appreciated without making much of it, was that Consolidated Industrial Supply, or rather the company that had bought them, had spent 2001 and 2002 running profitability analyses on exactly this market, and had concluded that it wasn't worth serving. Dale's secondary business, by 2010, was generating more revenue than his engine rebuilding. He had not set out to build a parts manufacturing operation. He had set out to keep his own shop running. The business had grown because the need existed and nobody else was meeting it. Let me tell you about 2011, because that's when the larger machinery arrived. Dale had spent the better part of a year watching his lathe struggle with certain crankshaft work. The tolerances he needed on some of the older diesel crankshafts were at the edge of what his 1960s era lathe could reliably hold. He needed a better machine. He found one in the estate sale of a closed manufacturing plant in Middlesboro, a 1978 LeBlond Regal engine lathe, 20 inches over the bed, with a 10-foot bed length and a threading capability that his current lathe didn't have. The asking price was $8,500. Dale drove to Middlesboro, inspected the machine for 2 hours, determined that it needed new spindle bearings and a rebuilt apron, but was otherwise sound, and bought it. He spent 6 weeks rebuilding it in the corner of his shop while continuing to run production on his existing lathe. When the LeBlond was running, he moved it to the center of the floor, and the old lathe went against the wall as a backup. With the LeBlond, he could hold crankshaft tolerances to half a 10,000th of an inch. That opened up crankshaft grinding and regrinding work that he had previously sent out to a specialty shop in Lexington. He brought it in-house. The Lexington shop, when they found out, called to ask what had changed. Dale told them he had gotten a better lathe. The Lexington shop's owner, a man who had been grinding crankshafts for 40 years, asked what kind. When Dale told him it was a 1978 LeBlond, there was a pause on the line, and then the man said, "Those are good machines." Dale said he knew. Carol retired from her job at the county school system in 2013, and came to work in the shop full-time. She took over the ledger, which by then had grown into a 3-ring binder with tabs organized by engine family and customer name, and she converted it to a computer database over the course of about 6 months, entering 10 years of transaction records by hand from the original ledger pages. Dale watched this process with the same expression he used when watching a machine tool make a cut he wasn't sure about. Attentive, slightly skeptical, ultimately impressed when the result came out right. The database told him things the ledger hadn't been able to show him. Which parts he sold most, which engine families were growing in demand, which customers were ordering more frequently. He used this information to adjust his raw stock purchasing and his machining schedule. By 2015, Whitmore Engine and Machine employed 4 people besides Dale and Carol. There was a machinist named Bobby Trent, who had come to Dale straight out of a vocational program at the community college in Cumberland, and who had, over 8 years, developed a feel for the Blanchard grinder that Dale considered almost as good as his own. There was a young man named Cody Napier, who ran the honing machine and the valve seat grinder, and who was, in Dale's estimation, the most naturally gifted hand he had ever trained. There was a woman named Sandra Holbrook, who handled shipping and receiving, and who had reorganized the part storage system 3 times in 5 years, each time making it faster and more logical, until the shop could locate any part in inventory in under 4 minutes. And there was Dale's son, Marcus, who had spent 6 years working in industrial maintenance in Lexington and had come home in 2013 with a knowledge of CNC machining that Dale didn't have and that the shop increasingly needed. Marcus had brought with him from Lexington a used Haas CNC turning center that he had purchased from a closing job shop for $14,000. He had rebuilt the control system himself, replacing failed components with modern equivalents that he sourced from an industrial electronics supplier in Cincinnati. The Haas sat in the back corner of the shop and made parts that Dale's manual machines could not make economically. Complex geometries, tight tolerances, and difficult materials, small runs of components that would have taken Dale 3 hours on the lathe and took the Haas 22 minutes. Dale watched Marcus program the machine with the same expression he had used watching Carol build the database. Attentive, skeptical, ultimately impressed. He did not pretend to understand the CNC programming. He understood the parts it made, and he understood whether they were correct, and that was enough. Marcus programmed the machine. Dale inspected the output. Between them, they covered the ground. Let me tell you about the phone call that came in January of 2018, because that's when the story turned in a direction that Dale had not anticipated. The call came from a man named Richard Ashby, who identified himself as a procurement manager for a regional electric utility based in Knoxville. The utility operated a fleet of older diesel generators at substations across eastern Tennessee and eastern Kentucky. Backup power equipment that had been installed in the 1970s and 1980s, and that the utility had been maintaining rather than replacing, because the replacement cost was, in Richard Ashby's words, prohibitive. The generators ran on a family of industrial diesel engines that had been manufactured by a company that no longer existed, and the parts supply for those engines had effectively dried up over the previous 5 years as the last of the original manufacturer's service parts inventory was consumed. The utility had been cannibalizing units to keep others running, but they were running out of donor machines. Richard Ashby had found Dale Whitmore's name through a contact at a county road department in Bell County, who had told him that if the parts didn't exist anywhere else, Dale Whitmore either had them or could make them. Dale asked Richard Ashby to send him the engine specifications and a list of the parts he needed. Richard sent a package that arrived 3 days later, a thick envelope containing original manufacturer's service manuals, parts catalogs, and a list of 23 specific components that the utility needed to keep their generator fleet running. Dale spread the documents across his workbench and spent an evening going through them. He recognized the engine family. He had rebuilt 2 of them years earlier for a mining operation in Letcher County. He knew the architecture. He pulled the original service manuals from his own filing cabinet. He'd kept every service manual he had ever acquired, filed by engine family, in a 4-drawer steel cabinet against the back wall, and cross-referenced them against what Richard Ashby had sent. Of the 23 components on the list, Dale could manufacture 19 of them with his existing equipment and raw stock sources. The remaining 4 were cast components that would require patterns and foundry work. He called the foundry in Barberville. They could pour the castings if Dale brought them patterns. Dale said he would make the patterns. He quoted Richard Ashby a price and a lead time. Richard Ashby was quiet for a moment and then said that the price was lower than he had expected and the lead time was shorter. Dale said he had the equipment and the knowledge and the materials, and that there was no reason for it to cost more or take longer than it needed to. The utility became a regular customer. Over the next 3 years, Dale's shop supplied the parts to keep 34 backup generators running at substations across 2 states. The utility's maintenance engineers visited the shop twice, once in 2018 and once in 2020, and both times they walked the floor with expressions that Dale recognized from Gerald Combs holding that piston up to the light in 2007. The expression of a person encountering something they had not expected to find in a place they had not expected to find it. Let me tell you about the morning in September of 2021 when Dale Whitmore turned 76 years old, because that morning tells you everything about what the previous 18 years had built. Marcus came in at 6:30 and found his father already at the Blanchard grinder, finishing a set of bearing caps for an order that needed to ship by noon. Bobby Trent arrived at 7 and started the LeBlond on a crankshaft journal. Cody Napier was running the honing machine by 7:15. Sandra Holbrook had the shipping station organized and was pulling orders before 8. The Haas in the back corner was running a program Marcus had set up the night before, turning out valve guides in batches of 12. The shop was running the way a good engine runs. Every component doing its work, nothing wasted, nothing forced, the whole system in balance. Carol brought a cake at noon. They ate it at the workbench with engine components on both sides of them, the same way she had brought dinner to the shop 18 years earlier when Dale was building shelves for the consolidated inventory. Dale was not a man who marked occasions with speeches. He ate his cake and looked at the shelves along the back wall, not the original wooden shelves he had built in 2003, which had been replaced twice as the inventory system evolved, but the current steel shelving that Sandra had organized, labeled, and mapped into the computer database, and he said to no one in particular that they were in pretty good shape. Marcus looked at him and said, "Yeah, Pop, we are. Let me tell you about what those shelves held, because the inventory tells the story better than any description of the man." There were, in the Whitmore engine and machine parts room in September of 2021, components for 47 distinct engine families spanning 6 decades of industrial and agricultural equipment manufacture. There were parts for engines that the original manufacturers had stopped supporting in the 1980s. There were parts for engines whose manufacturers no longer existed. There were components machined from raw stock by Dale's hands and Bobby Trent's hands, and the Haas in the back corner, sitting in labeled bins next to components purchased from specialty suppliers and the last of the original consolidated inventory, which Dale had rationed so carefully over 18 years that he still had a small quantity of certain critical items remaining. The room was not large. It was organized with a precision that made it feel larger than it was. Every bin was labeled. Every label corresponded to a record in Carroll's database. Every record included the engine families the part served, the raw material specification, the machining process, and the source, whether purchased or manufactured in-house. The shops that called Whitmore Engine and Machine in 2021 were not the same shops that had called in 2007. Some of those original shops had closed. Their owners had retired or given up or died, and the equipment they had serviced had passed to other hands or been scrapped. The shops that called now were younger operations, run by men and women who had come into the trade after the parts supply had already dried up, who had never known a time when you could call a distributor and order a piston for a 1968 Continental engine and have it arrive in a week. For them, Whitmore Engine and Machine was not a last resort. It was the first call. It was the place you called because you knew they had it or could make it, and because the price was fair and the quality was right, and the people on the phone knew what they were talking about. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story doesn't end with Dale Whitmore's 76th birthday and a piece of cake at a workbench. In the spring of 2023, Marcus Whitmore drove to a machine tool auction in Morristown, Tennessee, and came back with a surface grinder that had belonged to a closing aerospace subcontractor. The machine was a 1982 Okamoto, fully functional, with a precision that exceeded anything else in the shop. It cost $6,200. Marcus rebuilt the coolant system and replaced the wheel dresser and had it running within a month. With the Okamoto, the shop could hold surface finish tolerances on bearing surfaces that had previously required sending work to a specialty house in Charlotte. They brought that work in-house. The Charlotte shop called to ask what had changed. Marcus told them they had gotten a better surface grinder. The Charlotte shop asked what kind. When Marcus told them it was a 1982 Okamoto, there was a pause, and then the man said, "Those are good machines." Marcus said he knew. The filing cabinet with Dale's service manuals is still against the back wall of the shop. Dale added to it for 49 years, and Marcus has added to it since, and it now holds original manufacturer documentation for 61 engine families and 14 steel drawers that have been relabeled 3 times as the organizational system evolved. The manuals are not scanned. They are not in a cloud database. They are paper and hanging folders, organized by manufacturer and then by engine family, and every person in the shop knows how to use them. When a new engine family comes in that the shop hasn't seen before, Marcus pulls the manual, reads it the way his father taught him to read them, completely from the front, not skipping to the part you think you need, and then he goes to the floor and starts working. The Blanchard grinder that Dale bought in Knoxville in 1987 is still running. It has had 2 spindle rebuilds and a new table drive motor, and a set of ways that Bobby Trent reground in 2019 when the wear had accumulated to the point where it was affecting tolerances. It is not the same machine it was in 1987 in the sense that most of its wear components have been replaced. It is exactly the same machine in the sense that it does the same work to the same standard, and the knowledge of how to keep it doing that work has passed from Dale to Bobby Trent to Cody Napier, who now runs it most mornings while Bobby manages the newer equipment. Consolidated Industrial Supply's parent company was itself acquired in 2014 by a national industrial distributor that operates 340 locations across 28 states. They do not stock parts for engines manufactured before 1995. Their website has a search function that returns no results for Continental F244 pistons, or Detroit 6V53 rings, or Caterpillar 3306 pre-emissions valve guides. The search function works correctly. The parts simply aren't there. They know where to find them, though. The ones who need them badly enough always figure out where to find them. They end up on Route 119 in Harlan County, Kentucky, talking to Marcus Whitmore or Carol Whitmore or Bobby Trent, and they walk out with what they came for, and sometimes they ask how the shop has parts that nobody else has, and the answer is always the same. A man drove to Charleston in 2003 and bought everything that was left, and then he spent the next several years figuring out how to make what he couldn't buy, and he taught everyone around him how to do the same, and the shop never stopped running, and the knowledge never left the building, and the machines that were worth keeping got kept and got maintained and got passed down to hands that understood their value. There's a framed photograph on the wall above Dale's old workbench. It's a picture of Dale and his father, Everett, standing in front of an engine that Everett rebuilt in 1961. A big Continental flathead that had come out of a county road grader. Dale is maybe 16 in the photograph, standing next to his father with his arms at his sides, looking at the engine the way his father is looking at it, which is the way you look at something you understand completely and respect completely and are not finished with yet. The photograph has been on that wall since 1994. The workbench beneath it has changed. The tools around it have changed. The people working in the shop have changed. The photograph has not changed, and the way of looking at an engine that it captures has not changed, and that continuity is not an accident. It is the whole point. That's what happens when a man decides that the knowledge in his hands is worth more than the convenience of someone else's supply chain, and builds accordingly, and teaches the people around him to build the same way, and keeps the machines running that everyone else decided weren't worth keeping, because he understood that the value of a thing is not determined by whether a distributor's profitability matrix says it belongs in the catalog, but by whether it does the work when the work needs doing, and whether someone took the trouble to understand it well enough to keep it